Hello and welcome to the Hot News channel, where we analyze the breaking news. We are launching into a deep dive today, and we're synthesizing a really complex stack of reports, articles, and research. What they're painting is a picture of, well, aggressive international action by the U.S. administration colliding directly with some profound and worsening instability.
Right, across the globe and right here at home.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack this rapid succession of military, economic, and geopolitical events. We're talking about the highly unusual operation in Venezuela.
And the escalation with that Russian flag tanker.
Yes, that too. Plus the almost unbelievable threat leveled against Greenland. And all of this is happening alongside some really serious U.S. domestic political and economic concerns that seem to be coming to a head. So we're analyzing the global environment as of January 8th, 2026. The whole thing is being driven, really, by the massive international ripple effect that followed that very precise, very focused operation that resulted in the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Maduro and his wife.
What's fascinating here, I think, is how quickly the rules of the road are changing. And you can see how the global system is revealing its deepest stress fractures under all this pressure.
These aren't isolated events, are they?
No, not at all. They are connected by a core philosophical shift in U.S. foreign policy doctrine, a shift where accountability and international law are, increasingly viewed as optional constraints.
Rather than foundational rules.
Exactly. So we need to look beyond just the headlines and really analyze what this acceleration of unilateral aggression signals about the emerging multipolar world and the fracturing of traditional Western alliances.
Okay, let's unpack this centerpiece operation first. Venezuela. Analysts are drawing a pretty explicit comparison between what happened there and full-scale warfighting. They're concluding that the Venezuelan action was fundamentally different from prolonged conflicts like, say, the war in Ukraine. Let's start with the anatomy of this operation.
That comparison is vital. It's so important because it reveals the nature of modern intervention when the intervening power believes it has absolute technological and geopolitical superiority.
It's not a war, but something else.
Something else entirely. The Venezuela operation was described by its own planners as a swift, almost surgical, 2-hour snatch and grab. The objective was singular: capture President Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and extract them.
Without getting into a protracted conflict or an occupation.
Exactly. This approach is completely distinct from, say, the initial massive Russian military operation in Ukraine, which involved a multi-axis advance, millions of mobilized troops, and massive sustained industrial capacity requirements for a conventional war.
And the narrative that came out almost immediately focused on the success. 0 U.S. casualties, and the ability to capture a sitting head of state. This suggests the operational success wasn't due to overwhelming military might against a fortified enemy, but something else. Is that right?
That's absolutely the consensus among the intelligence analysts whose material we've looked at. The operational success was reportedly facilitated entirely by treason.
Treason?
Treason within Maduro's innermost circle, specifically within the Venezuelan Ministry of Defense. It suggests U.S. assets, and we're almost certainly talking about CIA operatives, had successfully turned key individuals extremely close to Maduro, which ensured minimal resistance.
So what were the mechanics of that? I mean, it sounds like they neutralized the country's defenses before the extraction team even touched down.
Precisely. This infiltration allowed them to neutralize Venezuela's primary air defenses, many of which were, Russian-supplied S-300 systems. They took them out ahead of the actual insertion.
And this was planned for a while.
Oh, yeah. The entire operation, we now know, was months in preparation. It finally got the top-level approval on December 25th, 2025. It involved highly specialized Delta Force personnel dropped by Chinook helicopters.
And the plan?
The operational plan was precise.
Yeah.
If any loyalist Venezuelan units moved to resist or failed to stand down as they were instructed by the turned officials, they were to be neutralized immediately. This level of internal betrayal meant the U.S. did not need to plan for a conventional, sustained fight against the national military.
So it was a precise, high-value targeting mission that just bypassed the need for any real conventional conflict. But that brings us to the, shifting justifications for this raid. Initially, the administration framed it in purely legal terms.
Right.
They called it a law enforcement operation to bring a brutal, corrupt dictator and drug trafficker to justice in the Southern District of New York.
And that legal framing, it immediately ran into significant analytical scrutiny. The indictment against Maduro linking him to narco-terrorism is viewed by critics as, well, flimsy and politically motivated.
Flimsy how?
If you look at the details, analysts note that the alleged crimes were often retroactively defined. The groups Maduro was supposedly supporting were labeled narco-terror groups, well after the time the alleged support occurred, sometimes post-2016. That makes the charges legally precarious.
It sounds like they were defining the crime to fit the political necessity.
Exactly. And the most absurd element, as highlighted in one of the legal reviews we saw, was the reliance on charges claiming Maduro issued diplomatic passports to people who were later involved in trafficking.
Okay, wait. Break that down.
I mean, think about the implications. This would be tantamount to charging a sitting U.S. president for issuing passports to DEA agents who might later be convicted of drug smuggling on the side. The bar for charging a sitting head of state is astronomically high under international law.
And this indictment didn't meet it.
It seemed designed for political effect, not for verifiable legal standing.
So given that the legal basis is so shaky, the political and economic justification then becomes the real story here. Many analyses, particularly from global commentators, argue this operation was an illegal intervention. They're describing it as an armed robbery.
An armed robbery and, if you consider the accompanying naval activities, a clear blockade, which is universally considered an act of war.
And this is where the administration eventually just dropped the pretense of law enforcement and got brutally honest about the real objectives.
Yes, mercantilist objectives. President Trump publicly declared that the goal was U.S. political control over Venezuela. Why? So that global competitors, specifically Russia and China, could not operate in what he termed our hemisphere without explicit U.S. authorization.
That is a profound statement. It's a return to a 19th century sphere of influence mindset.
Absolutely.
And the economics of that mindset were just as explicit. They weren't just seeking political influence. They were seeking financial control over the world's largest oil reserves.
The plan was clearly articulated. The U.S. would control the sale of Venezuela's oil. The revenues generated would be held and controlled entirely by the U.S. government. And crucially, Venezuela would then be required to only purchase American products and services with that money.
That's not just control. It's an enforced, transactional, and really restrictive economic model.
It is.
The description of armed robbery really sticks out, especially when you start to connect the dots to specific financial interests that benefited immediately from this military action. The sources specifically highlight the role of hedge fund manager Paul Singer.
This connection is central to understanding the transactional nature of this foreign policy decision. Paul Singer, who critics and activists often label a vulture capitalist.
Hang on, can you just explain what vulture capitalism means in this context for our listeners?
Certainly. In simple terms, a vulture capitalist buys up the distressed debt of a nation or a company, often at a steep discount, and then aggressively pursues legal and political means to force the debtor to pay back the full original face value to the debt plus interest.
And Singer's firm did this with a Venezuelan company.
Yes, his firm acquired Citgo Petroleum, the U.S.-based subsidiary of Venezuela's state oil company, a massively valuable asset. He acquired it for approximately $6 billion shortly before the military operation.
And the benefit of removing Maduro is?
The immediate benefit of removing Maduro and installing a U.S.-compliant regime is that it secures that investment. It ensures the courts can finalize the seizure and sale of that asset.
So the U.S. military action, taken under the guise of enforcing drug laws, actually served the direct financial interests of a powerful donor who stood to gain billions by controlling a key Venezuelan asset. That's a powerful indictment of the mission's true intent.
It absolutely illustrates a highly personalized foreign policy, one where specific financial interests and donor demands, in this case, controlling a portion of the world's largest proven oil reserves, supersede international law, diplomatic norms, or even long-term regional stability.
Okay, so despite the snatch and grab succeeding in removing the top two targets, U.S. officials, people like Trump and Senator Marco Rubio, were quick to declare they run Venezuela and have full control. But what is the actual reality on the ground in Caracas? Did they achieve comprehensive regime change?
Well, by nearly all accounts, they failed. And that is a critical point. They decapitated the leadership, removing the top two figures. But the core regime structure, the Chavista state apparatus, it remains intact and largely cohesive.
So the key players are still there?
The key players are still in place. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, Defense Minister Pedrino Lopez, Interior Minister Theodoro Cabello. Maduro's political party, the PSUV, remains functional. And crucially, the military hasn't splintered or switched allegiance en masse.
So instead of installing a compliant government, they've created this massive power vacuum at the very top, but left powerful, potentially hostile figures in command of the state machinery.
That's the danger. This is not the end of the Chavista revolution. The political and military structures are still motivated by a very strong anti-colonial nationalist ideology.
And does the administration have a plan for this?
The reports say they lack any concrete, detailed plan for a transitional government. They're banking solely on the belief that U.S. leverage, economic and military, is sufficient to force compliance from the remaining leaders.
They just assume they'll cooperate.
The assumption seems to be that figures like Vice President Rodriguez will be more pliable now that Maduro is gone.
That sounds like a profound gamble. I mean, it seems based on a misreading of the political will of the remaining Venezuelan elite.
It is a profound gamble. They are operating under the assumption that a combination of sanctions and the threat of further action will compel the current leadership to, quote, do their bidding. However, the business community is already showing hesitation.
Really?
Even with the political control declared by the U.S., major U.S. oil companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron, they are not rushing to invest the hundreds of billions of dollars needed to ramp up production of Venezuela's extremely heavy crude.
Why the hesitation? If the U.S. controls the oil, shouldn't they be eager to rush back in?
The economics are just very challenging. Ramping up production of heavy crude is a years-long process. It requires massive long-term capital investment. We're talking hundreds of billions.
Okay.
Moreover, heavy crude is expensive to refine, and right now it lacks the high international demand of lighter, sweeter crudes. The market uncertainty and the ongoing political instability, even without Maduro, are simply too high for the necessary capital commitments.
So a short-term political win, but a stalled long-term goal.
The U.S. may have secured a short-term political win, yes, but the actual long-term strategic goal of massively increasing oil output to compete with other global suppliers is stalled.
Right.
This is a very long, complex game, and the U.S. appears to have an exit strategy built entirely on hopeful coercion.
This Venezuelan operation, however, as we said at the top, is not an isolated incident. It's the latest and most aggressive manifestation of a much broader and more dangerous shift in U.S. global behavior. It points to an expanding sphere of military aggression that is sounding alarm bells globally.
That's the key synthesis we have to make for you, the listener. The core shift is structural. It's the systemic erosion of international law. We are observing the systematic replacement of decades, even centuries, of Western effort to establish rules for international interactions.
Rules governing sovereignty, non-intervention, trade.
All of it. And it's being replaced with what analysts describe as a pure appeal to might makes right.
This sounds like a profound move away from established U.S. foreign policy norms.
It is. We have effectively transitioned from the original Donroe Doctrine, which ironically was established to keep European empires out of the Western Hemisphere, to what some political scientists are now calling the Donroe Doctrine.
The Donroe Doctrine.
Where the U.S. unilaterally asserts its own empire and maintains physical control over political entities across South and Central America, treating the entire region as a transactional resource zone.
And the pattern of unconstrained military action from this administration is now massive. We've seen actions conducted without any congressional approval across the globe.
Absolutely. We can just list the recent unilateral strikes. You have actions against alleged drug boats in the Caribbean and Pacific, even though the intelligence shows most of those drug shipments are headed to Europe, not the U.S.
Right.
Then there are attacks in the Red Sea against Houthi targets, operations in Yemen, strikes in Nigeria, previous confrontations with Iran, and now Venezuela. The sources confirm the administration operates with what it believes are no constraints.
And the administration's legal justification for this lack of constraint seems to be, what, citing prior presidential actions and Congress's own inaction?
That's the core of the argument. The administration argues that since prior presidents have conducted military actions without a formal declaration of war, and since Congress consistently refuses to assert its constitutional authority to declare war or constrain military funding.
Congress has essentially abdicated that power.
That's the word they use, abdicated. Therefore, the executive branch feels free to conduct military actions wherever it deems necessary to advance U.S. interests. And this reinforces the view among adversaries and even skeptical allies that the U.S. is increasingly acting as a rogue state.
This lawlessness took an extremely dangerous turn recently, leading to an open escalation with Russia over the seizure of a merchant vessel in the North Atlantic. Tell us the specifics of the tanker incident.
This was a rapid, high-risk escalation. The U.S. military, reportedly assisted by elements of the UK Navy, seized the oil tanker Marinera. It's also been identified in other reports as Pella 1 or Pella 1 while it was transiting the North Atlantic.
And what was the stated pretext for this seizure? What was the reason they gave?
The U.S. claimed it was a law enforcement action tied to running the newly established Venezuelan blockade. The ship, they argued, was attempting to transport Venezuelan crude in violation of U.S. sanctions and the blockade measures put in place following the Maduro operation.
And Russia's response.
Moscow was immediately forceful in its response. They insisted the ship was Russian-flagged, Russian-owned, and carrying cargo that, in Russia's view, it was legally entitled to trade, regardless of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela.
And the Russian condemnation was stark, calling the seizure unacceptable behavior. How did they back up that warning?
They backed it up with immediate naval signaling. Russia warned that, from now on, any future merchant ships deemed to be under threat by U.S. or allied forces would receive immediate naval protection.
And we saw that happen.
We saw initial evidence of this with the alleged deployment of a Russian nuclear submarine to the area to protect the tanker's crew or potentially assert force if the U.S. attempted to divert the vessel further.
A nuclear asset. That's severe escalation in response to seizing a merchant ship.
It is the highest level of conventional signaling. While the U.S. is attempting to downplay the incident, claiming it was purely a blockade enforcement action, the reality is that escalating interference with clearly identified Russian ships, especially in the North Atlantic, is dangerously raising the risk of a direct superpower confrontation.
Wow.
This is a level of direct, zero-sum tension and risk that has not been witnessed consistently since the deepest periods of the Cold War.
Yeah.
The margin for miscalculation is shrinking very, very fast.
Shifting to the diplomatic and alliance front, the fracturing of NATO and the transactional nature of U.S. relationships were made brutally clear by this bizarre Greenland ultimatum. I mean, Trump's threat to take or buy Greenland is an explicit return to 19th century colonial gunboat diplomacy.
It is truly stunning in its implications. It treats sovereign territory as a disposable asset. The threat, publicly stated as being in the U.S. national interest, forced Denmark's prime minister to issue a public formal rebuttal.
Right, she had to come out and say, Greenland's not for sale.
She reaffirmed that Greenland's future is for Greenlanders and Denmark alone. Furthermore, Denmark's Ministry of Defense confirmed to reporters that their 1952 Standing Rules of Engagement explicitly required Danish soldiers to attack any invading forces on Danish soil.
So that puts Denmark, a founding NATO member, in a position of potentially needing to use military force against the United States, another NATO member. That's an alliance fracture in the making.
It is the definition of a NATO-on-NATO conflict scenario. However, what we are seeing from U.S. analysts is a widely held belief that Europe will ultimately, acquiesce to these demands or threats.
Why?
Because of the overwhelming leverage the U.S. holds.
What is that leverage, precisely?
It centers entirely on security against Russia and the resolution of the Ukraine conflict. Trump has publicly asserted that Russia and China have zero fear of NATO without the United States and claims that he is the only figure they genuinely fear.
And Europe is dependent on the U.S. for security.
That dependence, its inability to project significant power independently, and its financial investment in the Ukraine conflict mean the U.S. can effectively demand major concessions, like the potential transfer of Greenland, as the price for maintaining alliance cohesion and security guarantees.
So if Europe wants the U.S. to handle Russia, they have to accept becoming a vassal state, basically conceding sovereign points when demanded.
That is precisely the framework being discussed in strategic circles. Yeah. It's a transactional protection racket dynamic. The U.S. provides the security umbrella, and in return, the European partners must tolerate profound violations of their sovereignty and democratic norms when it serves U.S. interests. This makes the transatlantic alliance look less like a partnership and more like a conditional security agreement.
While all this aggressive geopolitical maneuvering is happening abroad, we have to turn our focus back home because the domestic U.S. picture is showing some really serious accelerating cracks. And it starts with the economy and the job market. That market is sending a very clear signal of rapidly slowing momentum heading into 2026.
The signal we're seeing is that the labor market is entering a slow-motion collapse. It's being driven by deteriorating business confidence rather than aggressive mass layoffs.
So what are the numbers telling us?
The latest Bureau of Labor Statistics data was stark. U.S. job openings fell to 7.1 million, which is the lowest level we have seen in over a year. Critically, This figure was down from 7.4 million just the month prior, and it fell below every single market expectation.
We hear a lot about job growth, but you're pointing out that the number of job openings is the canary in the coal mine here. Why is that specific metric so important right now?
It's crucial because, for the last several years, the U.S. labor market has been highly dynamic. It was fueled by what economists call high churn, meaning people were quitting their current jobs in high numbers because they knew they could immediately jump to a new role for better pay, signing bonuses, and improved conditions.
Right.
When employers suddenly stop posting new job openings, that high churn stops instantly. Those opportunities dry up very, very fast, which removes workers' negotiating power and creates a rapid cooling effect on wages and mobility, even if the headline unemployment rate initially looks moderate.
And we are seeing that cooling effect reflected in the other key metric, the unemployment rate itself.
We are. The unemployment rate unexpectedly jumped to 4.6% in November. That is the highest level since mid-2021. And while 4.6% is not historically catastrophic by, say, pre-Great Recession standards, the context makes economists extremely nervous.
What's the context?
We're seeing a combination of stalling job creation, rapidly slowing hiring rates, which have fallen back to levels last seen during the early pandemic and the aftermath of the Great Recession, and profoundly eroding consumer and business confidence.
And what's driving this widespread employer pullback? Is it a fear of recession or something else?
The consensus among the Fed transcripts and economic analysts is that uncertainty is the single biggest factor. There is policy uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, and economic uncertainty regarding inflation and interest rates. So employers are just hitting the pause button.
What does that mean, hitting the pause button?
They are prioritizing decreasing their operational costs, which often means a hiring freeze or soft layoffs through attrition, rather than investing in expansion, capital projects, or new hires. This trend is already very clear, and unless business confidence and hiring patterns reverse dramatically, this slowdown is highly likely to define the entire 2026 economic outlook.
Leading to tougher competition for workers and downward pressure on real wages.
That's the bottom line.
Now, moving from the economy to security, we saw a horrifying convergence of these aggressive foreign policies with domestic law enforcement in Minneapolis this week, specifically concerning the killing of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE agent during what was initially reported as a protest action.
This incident has become the immediate flashpoint demonstrating the dangerous politicization of security and the use of federal agencies for domestic enforcement against political dissent. The Trump administration was lightning fast in labeling the Act 1 of domestic terrorism.
But eyewitness accounts paint a radically different and deeply disturbing picture.
They do.
What do the eyewitness reports suggest happened?
Witnesses suggest that the ICE agent shot the unarmed woman point blank through her windshield as she was driving away from the scene. Critically, the agent was reportedly already cleared from any immediate danger of being run over.
So he wasn't in danger.
She had already turned her wheels to avoid hitting him before he fired from the driver's side window. This suggests the lethal force was not used in self-defense, but as an aggressive enforcement measure.
The administration's rapid deployment of the domestic terrorism label is crucial here, isn't it? Because it immediately attempts to give the ICE agent a layer of legal cover. It frames the event not as a potential police misconduct case, but as a justified counterterror operation.
And that framework is provided by a very important and often misunderstood executive action, National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, or NSPM 7, signed back in September. We really need to pause and understand this.
Okay, so what is NSPM 7?
NSPM 7 fundamentally reclassifies how the federal government views internal unrest and political protest.
How does it achieve that reclassification?
It directs federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies to stop treating certain acts of protest, resistance, or anti-government actions, especially those associated with anti-fascist movements or environmental resistance, as isolated criminal acts, which would normally fall under local or federal criminal law.
And instead?
Instead, it commands that these acts be viewed as organized terror-linked campaigns.
So once a group or action is designated as terror-linked, what does that mean for an agency like ICE is? I mean, ICE is fundamentally a civil immigration and enforcement body.
Exactly. But once designated as terror-linked, agencies like ICE can suddenly operate inside a counter-terror framework. This dramatically lowers the threshold for the use of lethal force and broadens surveillance powers. It essentially transforms what should be a civil enforcement or minor criminal procedure into a military or counter-terror procedure.
Making excessive use of force a formalized procedure rather than a tragedy requiring accountability.
Precisely.
This sounds like a legal mechanism to justify the unitary executive theory, the idea that the president has almost unchecked constitutional power to act against perceived enemies of the state.
It is entirely in line with that theory. NSPM 7 allows the executive branch to justify invoking constitutional powers, powers intended for use against foreign enemies or existential threats, and apply them to domestic political opposition. It is the legal apparatus underpinning the aggressive transactional behavior we are seeing both abroad and at home.
Now let's pivot to a massive political distraction that may be intentionally covering up an ongoing domestic scandal: the Epstein files. The deadline for releasing these documents, December 19th, has long passed, and yet only a tiny fraction has been released.
The delay is astounding and, frankly, suspicious. The original court order was clear, yet over 2 weeks past the deadline, only about 1% of the total files have been released. We're talking 12,285 documents out of what is estimated to be millions.
And the government body responsible for reviewing and redacting these files is the Southern District of New York, the SDNY.
That's right.
And where is the SDNY focusing its massive resources right now, if not on this court-ordered domestic scandal?
The SDNY is currently dedicating massive legal resources, including an estimated 125 experienced federal lawyers, to the criminal charges and the impending trial of the deposed Venezuelan dictator, Nicholas Maduro. Their focus is entirely on a high-profile, politically charged, foreign intervention case based on a questionable indictment.
So it appears that this high-profile foreign policy action, the seizure and criminal trial of a head of state, is serving as an intentional, tactical distraction from the profound domestic political scandal contained within those Epstein files.
That is precisely the speculation among political commentators. They argue the SDNY's total focus on this foreign case, despite the clear legal obligation to release the domestic documents, serves to keep the public conversation away from a scandal that reportedly implicates highly powerful individuals.
Both political and financial figures.
Yes, who may be vulnerable to ongoing blackmail or political leverage based on their inclusion in those files. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle are reportedly furious, with some threatening legal action against those they believe are holding up the court-ordered process.
Let's zoom back out and examine how major geopolitical competitors, particularly China, are responding to this increasingly aggressive and unilateral U.S. strategy. China is clearly not standing still. It's exerting its own massive economic leverage.
China is acting as a major pole in this emerging multipolar world. We often forget the scale of their economic power. Based on purchasing power parity, which adjusts GDP figures to account for differences in costs of goods and services.
Giving a truer measure of domestic buying power.
Right. China's economy is estimated to be $5 trillion larger than the United States. They are technologically advanced, and historically they have lifted 845 million people out of extreme poverty in the last 45 years. This economic muscle gives them powerful tools to affect geopolitical outcomes.
Just to clarify, when we talk about purchasing power parity, or PPP, we're saying that while the nominal dollar value might be lower, the actual economic engine inside China is larger because the dollars they spend go further than they do in the U.S.
Precisely. It gives a more realistic view of their domestic industrial capacity and sustained economic strength. And they are showing an immediate willingness to wield that power, as we saw with the swift economic retaliation against Japan over their diplomatic stance on Taiwan.
We need to unpack that retaliation. What did China do, and what impact is it having on Japan?
China immediately implemented a massive broad-based ban on the export of over 800 critical industrial and technological inputs to Japan. This isn't just finished goods. It includes essential chemicals, specialized electronics components, and critical sensors that are foundational to Japan's high-tech manufacturing sector.
And the impact?
The impact is profound because Japan relies on China for approximately 20% of its total global trade.
So it sounds like China is using its industrial base to apply excruciating targeted pressure on a U.S. ally.
It is highly effective pressure. By controlling the supply chain for fundamental technological inputs, China can impose massive economic pain on nations that align too closely with aggressive U.S. policy on issues like Taiwan. This demonstrates that U.S. competitors have effective, non-military tools to respond to American aggression tools that can cripple the economies of U.S. partners.
Now, connecting this back to Venezuela, the U.S. action there was clearly aimed at cutting off a potential supply of Venezuelan heavy oil to China, reducing China's energy security. But this move seems to have already backfired, creating a beneficial geopolitical shift for China.
It has created a classic example of unintended consequences. Canada, which is a major exporter of heavy oil, recognized that the U.S., now controlling Venezuelan assets, will eventually rely on discounted Venezuelan heavy crude to supply its own markets.
Which would undercut the price and demand for Canadian oil.
Exactly.
So what was Canada's strategic move in response?
Canada is defensively shifting its heavy oil exports away from the U.S. and directly towards China. And crucially, many of these transactions are now being paid for in Chinese yuan rather than U.S. dollars.
So that's a double threat to the U.S.
It is. First, it secures China's energy supply despite the Venezuela operation. And second, it actively facilitates de-dollarization in the global energy trade, further eroding the dominance of the U.S. dollar.
Shifting to the Middle East, Iran remains highly unstable, providing another arena for potential U.S. intervention. What is the internal situation fueling dissent there?
Internal conditions for ordinary Iranians are profoundly distressing, driven primarily by ongoing, crippling economic conditions. We're talking about massive inflation, high unemployment, and the sharp devaluation of the Iranian currency, the rial.
Which reduces purchasing power for the average family.
Dramatically. And while this dissent is genuine and rooted in economic desperation, these internal sentiments are profoundly vulnerable to being hijacked by geopolitical actors.
Meaning external powers can manipulate or fund those protests to turn them violent or directed against the regime for strategic purposes?
Exactly. And the Trump administration has been quick to issue explicit external threats that appear to exploit this internal instability. The president recently tweeted a warning, threatening direct intervention if Iran violently kills peaceful protesters, stating unequivocally that the U.S. is locked and loaded and ready to go.
That language leans into a humanitarian or a liberal democratic justification for military action, but many analysts view it as simply an excuse to launch a conflict.
It's viewed with immense skepticism, especially given the continuous military buildup in the region. The analysis suggests that the U.S. is using the pretext of protecting peaceful protesters to justify a possible launch of a highly destructive conflict against Iran.
This brings us directly back to Venezuela. There's a suggestion of a clear, explicit link between the Maduro operation and a potential war with Iran.
There is.
What is that connection? Why would seizing Maduro be tied to an action against Iran?
The connection is noted by several influential geopolitical commentators and military analysts. Reports indicate that the final decision to launch the strikes and the kidnapping operation in Venezuela was made while Trump was meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
And after that meeting,
Netanyahu subsequently gave a high-profile interview publicly stressing the existential threat Venezuela posed to Israel and the U.S. due to its deep ties with Tehran.
And how has that meeting been interpreted in the source material?
This timing and the public statements have led some commentators to claim there was a Zionist tinge to the Venezuela operation, meaning it was strongly influenced by Israeli strategic interests. The argument is that the removal of Maduro was a calculated, necessary step to clear the strategic field, eliminating a key Venezuelan-Iranian geopolitical node.
And thus paving the way for
a potential and far more destructive second war with Iran that Israel has long desired.
Finally, let's address Europe's ongoing strategic miscalculation regarding the Ukraine conflict. The recent Paris summit saw the E3 leaders, Britain, France, and Germany, discussing sending troops into Ukraine post-ceasefire to provide security guarantees. Sources suggest this reveals a profound disconnection from military reality.
The plans appear deeply disconnected from actual military capability and industrial capacity. European leaders are discussing military intervention options, but the reality is stark. Europe does not currently possess the industrial capacity, the trained manpower, or the logistical sustainment necessary to engage in conventional conflict with Russia.
Can you quantify that disparity for the listener?
The analysis we reviewed estimates that Russia's current arms and industrial production capacity after years of preparation and mobilization is 3 times that of the entire combined West, including the United States.
3 times? Wow!
Analysts explicitly warn that if European conventional forces were sent into a conflict scenario in Ukraine, they would likely be destroyed within a week due to overwhelming Russian fire superiority, electronic warfare capabilities, and sheer volume of sustained industrial output.
And the risk of conventional conflict escalating is off the charts, precisely because of this conventional disparity.
That is the tragic reality underpinning NATO's strategy. Conventionally, NATO Europe is significantly weaker than Russia in terms of troop numbers, training, and sustainment capacity. So if NATO forces or any European expeditionary forces started losing conventionally, which is highly likely, it is militarily improbable that Washington, London, and Paris would allow themselves to face defeat without initiating nuclear use to prevent it.
So nuclear use is the backstop.
Nuclear deterrence isn't just about preventing first strikes. It's designed to forestall conventional defeat when you're faced with a superior ground force.
This overwhelming dependency on the U.S. for security, coupled with intense pressure to adhere to the political consensus on Russia, is revealing serious cracks in the EU's foundational rules of law itself, particularly regarding the sanction regime against academics and journalists.
This is a profound collapse of legal norms at the supranational level, and it demands scrutiny. We are seeing individuals, like the highly respected former Swiss intelligence Colonel Jacques Baud, sanctioned by the European Union.
And what do those sanctions involve?
They involve freezing their assets and restricting their travel, not for breaching criminal law or financial regulations, but purely because their fact-based analysis, which often relies on Western military sources and established facts, is deemed pro-Russian or inconvenient to the prevailing political narrative.
So the EU is using sanctions, which are typically foreign policy tools, to enforce an ideological viewpoint domestically.
Exactly. The EU Foreign Ministers' Council used these sanctions as a pure foreign policy measure, not a legal one requiring due process or established criminal proof. This effective criminalization of inconvenient facts and dissent, even when factually correct, directly undermines the very Enlightenment values of reason, due process, and law that Europe claims to champion.
It demonstrates that the political objective of maintaining cohesion against Russia is now overriding fundamental legal protections within the EU's structure itself.
It does.
As we synthesize all these moving pieces, from the snatch and grab in Caracas to the domestic security shift in Minneapolis to the fracturing alliances in Paris, what is the central systemic takeaway that connects all these events?
The primary takeaway is the profound and systematic crisis of law and the trampling of sovereignty that is now globalized and driven by U.S. actions. The illegal kidnapping in Venezuela based on flimsy charges, the seizure of a Russian tanker with no basis in international law, and the explicit threats to Danish sovereignty over Greenland.
They're all part of a pattern.
They all demonstrate the systematic replacement of verifiable facts and established law with what the administration's backers term alternative facts, and a relentless doctrine of might makes right.
The U.S. is essentially acting as a law unto itself, both constitutionally and internationally.
Precisely. The U.S. is now widely viewed globally, not just by adversaries like China and Russia, but even by traditional skeptical allies as what can only be described as a rogue nation.
And this has consequences.
This erosion of credibility and the consistent disregard for norms have devastating long-term consequences, chief among them, strategic vulnerability. The U.S. is dedicating immense resources and political focus to securing low-hanging fruit operations, like the Venezuelan snatch and grab, diverting critical attention, intelligence, and military assets away from the far more crucial existential issue, preventing a catastrophic war with China over Taiwan.
That focus shift from great power competition to transactional regional actions sounds like a massive, potentially fatal strategic mistake. But the deepest systemic danger we uncovered may be financial, and the outlook we are seeing from transcripts advising wealthy clients is incredibly dark and urgent.
The financial transcripts we reviewed from high-net-worth advisors paint a terrifying picture of anticipated instability and currency erosion. Wealthy clients are being advised to take immediate, drastic action. Divest aggressively from dollar-denominated assets.
What does that mean in practice?
This means shifting capital into physical precious metals like gold, into strategic commodity exposure, and notably into yuan-denominated bonds and real assets located in politically stable non-Western jurisdictions.
Why are they being advised to flee the dollar? What is the expected outcome they are preparing for?
The expectation is clear. A systemic financial correction that will result in the U.S. dollar experiencing 30 to 45% purchasing power erosion over the short to medium term. This is not just inflation. This is an expectation of significant currency devaluation.
And there's more.
Furthermore, these advisors anticipate the inevitable imposition of capital controls to manage the outflow of money.
We need to make sure the listener understands what capital controls mean in this context.
Capital controls are government-imposed restrictions on the ability of people or businesses to move money in or out of a country. They are scripted, according to these financial documents, to be communicated to the public as temporary measures designed to protect financial system stability during a crisis.
But for the wealthy?
But for the wealthy, it means locking them into dollar assets as the currency collapses, hence the urgency to divest now.
And this preparation isn't just theoretical on the part of individual investors. The financial system itself is actively preparing for mass retail flight.
Yes. The documents reveal that major banks are running extensive stress tests, assuming a 15% to 25% deposit flight within 30 days of a major financial trigger event. They are actively advocating for capital controls behind the scenes to contain this inevitable panic.
So what's the chilling conclusion from all this?
The chilling conclusion derived from this financial analysis is that the policy elite, those in power, are not preventing crisis. They're positioning to profit from the coming instability and collapse. Meanwhile, those with less than $100,000 in assets are simply being advised to secure essential goods, effectively being written off from the financial system's contingency plans.
This deep dive has shown us the intertwined nature of aggressive military action abroad, the accelerating domestic economic slowdown, and the systemic erosion of international and constitutional norms, all leading to potentially catastrophic financial vulnerability. The administration is acting on a hyper-transactional might-makes-right foreign policy model that prioritizes short-term political wins and the interests of specific donors over global and domestic stability. The critical question for you, the listener, is this. How long can a nation successfully behave like a rogue state abroad, trampling sovereignty and law and engaging in distractionary conflicts, while its domestic economy is cracking and its entire financial foundation is being simultaneously undermined by the very policy elite positioned to profit from its collapse?
Subscribe to our channel for more breaking news and press like if you liked our news analysis, and say goodbye until we meet again.